Welcome back, everybody, to linuxacademy.com. My name is Terry. In today's course, we continue with Jenkins Quick Start. So in this video, now that we've set up a Jenkins build slave, I want to show you a couple of different ways that we can use the build slave to execute builds and things that we need to keep in mind when we're using our build slaves to execute builds. So let's go into our test builds. And let's create a brand new build. So in this build, we're going to say my slave build. And we're going to leave it as a freestyle project and click OK. Now to force the Jenkins master to offload this build to the slave, we have to restrict where this project can be run because we have to pass in a label. The way we've set up our build slave is that only builds that basically call the label that we're talking about can run on the build slave. Typically, the master would control it based upon whatever conditions that I've configured, including if all of the executors on the Jenkins master server are busy doing other things, but there's an available build slave with executors open, it will offload that build to one of its slaves. In this case, let's just indicate that we want this build to run on the CentOS slave. So this particular slave right here. So label CentOS slave 1 is serviced by one node. If we had created multiple slaves and we indicated a label called CentOS slave group, for example, it would say something along the lines of label CentOS slave group is serviced by however many nodes happen to be in that pool of slaves that are available for us. The build environment, we would do execute shell script on the remote host using SSH. Or we can go down here and just execute a shell. Because we're going to be executing on the remote shell, it doesn't have to be remote. I'll show you that in a minute. So all we're going to do here is let's do a sudo cat var log messages. And we'll go ahead and save. Let's actually see on our build node over here, our slave node, cat etc hostname. All right, let's just make sure that we're getting one that we can see. So let's just do a sudo cat etc hostname. That way it's obvious where it executes on. So we'll go ahead and hit save. We've restricted this particular build to build on the build slave that we've set up, which happens to be tcox2, and our build basically is catting a file on that build slave. And we have SSH key exchange set up between them with the Jenkins user ID, so we should have any issues in executing that build, right? So let's go ahead and click on build now, and we get the nice blue icon that tells us it was successfully. We do the console output, we can see building remotely, and it executes correctly on tcox2.mylabserver.com. Now, what if I am going to execute a build remotely that's going to connect to another host? Well, then I have to be sure that I have access from the build slave to the host that I'm going to connect to. In this case, it'll be our master, because those are the two nodes that we have in our environment. But we can treat it like a node. We can do builds on the master from the slave, but we have to have the kind of access that is necessary. So do I have access from my build slave to my build node? So if I do an SSH to tcox1, for example, I'll connect, but it's going to ask me for a password. So I need to be sure that I set up credentials here that allow me to connect from my slave node to my primary master or any other node that I may be connecting to from here. So let's do an SSH keygen, and we'll just leave it there. Are we on the slave node? No, we're okay. So our key node, our key already exists. So now that we've got the key exists here, we'll just do a copy ID to Jenkins at Oh, I've already got the keys exchanged. So I have to be sure that I have the SSH keys exchanged. Let's test the fact that I do. So SSH tcox1 and the Jenkins tcox1 password. So I do not have them set up. So let's do an SSH keygen. And we've created that key. And let's do an SSH copy ID Jenkins at tcox1.mylabserver.com. Yes. And Jenkins at tcox1.labserver is password. And now finally I should be able to do an SSH tcox1 and get logged in, which I can. All right. Remember, we set up keys for Jenkins to go from master node to, in this case, slave node or any other node that we may be executing builds on. But now that we have a slave node with the agent running that may allow us to run builds on other nodes, I have to exchange the key for the Jenkins user to all other servers so that that way we can reciprocate in how we log in our environments. So let's go back over here to the project. Let's go to Jenkins and manage Jenkins. We're going to go to configure system because what I want to do here is I want to add another node. So let's do add node tcox1.mylabserver.com. We're going to treat it like any other host. Port 22. Jenkins is the user. Of course, we're going to use the same key. And we'll go ahead and save. If we go back to manage Jenkins, configure system, then we should see we have localhost, tcox2, and tcox1 set up for us to pick. Okay, so now we go up here to Jenkins in test builds. Let's create another new build. In this case, my test remote build. Freestyle project. Click OK. I'm going to restrict where this build can be run. So we'll do that here. And then we're going to execute shell on remote host. Now, keep in mind that when I say in this case, we're executing the shell on the remote host, it's remote to the place that we're executing the shell from. Meaning, because I'm going to be running this on the build slave, it's going to be remote to the build slave, which is why we went and set up tcox1. Now we have the ability, because we've set up the keys on the back end, to be exchanged with our Jenkins master, which we're treating as a node. We now have the ability to do, for example, sudo cat etc hostname. And let's go ahead and click save. And my test remote build, we'll go ahead and say build now. And once the build has completed, then we get the nice little blue icon that shows us our console output, and we see we executed correctly from the CentOS slave back to tcox1 over SSH correctly. So we were able to execute on the slave node, which we see right here, the Jenkins slave, on CentOS slave 1. We executed a script that went back to tcox1 and pulled the value that we were looking for, tcox1.mylabserver. So in our case, all we have to remember is we need to be able to have set the keys for the Jenkins user between all of the hosts that communicate as either the Jenkins master or a Jenkins agent or any of the nodes that may have remote builds executed on them. So my Jenkins master has to be able to communicate with the slave using SSH keys or username and password. You can do username and password. I prefer keys, because if then it's a lot easier to replace a key than to go around changing passwords on everything. If something is lost or if something is compromised, number one, from a security and a best practices perspective. So, and then that way I also don't have to know what the that particular user doesn't have to know what the password is, and they can still set up builds by passing in the path to the key itself. So that way we don't have to share the Jenkins password with anybody who may use that to create a build in the Jenkins environment. So my master has to be able to communicate with the SSH keys, in our case with the nodes, as well as the slave. And then the slave needs to reciprocate in that it can communicate going back, originating a communication to the master, as well as any of the nodes that it may need to run jobs against. It's just a way of keeping our environment in sync so that we can run builds from wherever we want, regardless of whether it's coming from a master or slave. It's treated correctly when we set up the build, particularly since we're controlling, in these cases, the build from executing on a particular host. So for running jobs on your build slaves directly, as well as running jobs on your build slave that connect to other nodes in your environment, and how we set up the security settings for those, that's all there is to it. My name is Terry for Linux Academy.